Well, good morning and good evening and good afternoon to all our online viewers, wherever you may be. My name is Russell Shao. I am the Executive Director of the Global Taiwan Institute. GTI is a 501c3 think tank dedicated exclusively to Taiwan policy research and related programs. Our mission is to enhance the relationship between the United States and Taiwan with the world by contributing to a more informed discussion about Taiwan and its people. In pursuit of that mission, we undertake several major programs. They include a bi-weekly publication called the Global Taiwan Brief, where we feature timely analysis and opinions about current developments related to Taiwan. We also organize regular public seminars, like the webinar that you are all participating in here today, where we feature timely commentaries and assessments and analysis about Taiwan as well. We organize an annual symposium, usually in the fall, where we organize leading academics and policymakers to discuss the past, present, and future of U.S.-Taiwan relations. In addition to these policy-focused research programs, we also facilitate academic exchanges as well through our scholarship program, where we sponsor academics and researchers who are interested to conduct field research in Taiwan, and vice versa as well for Taiwanese researchers to perform short-term field research here in the United States. In addition to all these programs, we also have cultural programs, and you can find all the information about these related programs on our website at www.globaltaiwan.org, where you may also subscribe to receive all our updates directly in your inbox. Now, I'd be remiss if I started today's program without thanking our co-founders, our directors, as well as our advisors, and all our staff and interns who make all our programs possible. So let's begin today's program. I'm very pleased to host today's virtual conversation with Dan Blumenthal on his new book, The China Nightmare: The Grand Ambitions of a Decaying State, as part of GTI's book talk series. Now, under the leadership of General Secretary Xi Jinping, the People's Republic of China has rapidly become one of the foremost powers on the world stage. With a vast population, a growing economy, and a modernizing military, China's strengths are clearly on display for the world to see. Nevertheless, the PRC's path forward is far from clear. Beneath the surface lies fundamental internal challenges and what the author would describe as the decay of an empire. Rather than liberalizing its system of governance, as Western academics and policymakers have long hoped and predicted, China has grown increasingly authoritarian. As its treatment of Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang and pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong have made clear, the PRC is determined to stamp out domestic dissent and further consolidate the power of the Chinese Communist Party, which this author argues is more a reflection of its weaknesses than strengths. These trends are raising alarms in both Washington and Taipei. And in this discussion today, we will cover Dan's analysis on the implications of China's rise as a competitor to the United States, with a focus, which he artfully outlines in The China Nightmare, its desire to satisfy external ambitions while dealing with vexing internal weaknesses. We will also get his thoughts on the role of the United States and also Taiwan, as well as many of US allies and partners in perhaps countering that. For all our live audience members, you may send your questions directly by email to contact@globaltaiwan.org, or by using the chat function on our YouTube page, or you may also tweet us at globaltaiwan.org. Now, you have Dan's biography that's available on the event announcement as well as on our website, but I would like to just also briefly introduce Dan as well. Dan Blumenthal is the resident fellow and the director of Asian Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on East Asian security issues and Sino-American relations. He has served and advised the US government on China issues for more than a decade. And before joining AEI, Mr. Blumenthal served as Senior Director for China, Taiwan, and Mongolia at the US Department of Defense. And he's also served as Commissioner of the congressionally mandated US-China Economic and Security Review Commission, among other postings as well. So Dan, thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Fantastic. So what I like to do with these events and these book talks is really to start with an open-ended question for you, and really to get at the heart of their inspirations for writing this book. So, what are your motivations and inspiration for writing the China Nightmare?
Well, thank you, Russell. So I've been in the policy world for a long time and served in government and advised the executive branch of the U.S. government and the congressional branch of the U.S. government, and served in it. And I wanted for a while to take a step back and really try to understand more foundational issues with respect to why China behaves the way that it does. That we have a geopolitical foe, a geopolitical rival of the kind that we really haven't seen in our history, I would argue, that we're also economically intertwined with. And it's important to do a really clinical diagnostic on exactly what the nature of that rival looks like. So that's number one, was sort of in-depth understanding, including some historical understanding of how it became the China we see today. And then the second piece is to contribute to the policy discussion by essentially saying that while China is formidable, it has a host of inhibitions and impediments and vulnerabilities that make it more manageable for us, in the sense that if we really want to compete with it, we can do so successfully.
Now, so let's jump in then on the content of the book. So, what is then the primary thing and the key arguments that you are presenting in this book?
Well, so I would say a number of key arguments. First, I'd say let's go through and analyze the strengths of this competitor to the United States, right? And so it is the key argument is it is ambitious. The scale of China is so big, it's hard to even get your head around. So it's even if you say, as I do, that the economy is slowing and it has other vulnerabilities, it's still, the scale is so big, it can do things at a level that the United States can't even do. Very ambitious in terms of reordering the global international system, in terms of building up its military technological power, in terms of reconstituting, what it sees as its rightful territories, including Taiwan. And so that's one major argument, is to go through its ambitions and its strengths. I think the difference between this and other books that do that is it also details its own perceptions of where it's weak and insecure, which I think is a contribution, because I think most China books fall into the category of China's 10 feet tall and there's nothing we can do about it, or China's about to collapse. And I don't see either scenario.
Mm-hmm. Well, can we just kind of go in there without sort of giving it all the way? But I do think, like you said, the contribution of this book has been, in very detailed manner, dissecting the weaknesses of China. And so, for our audience members who may be only familiar with really the strength aspect of China's rise, what are some of the key weaknesses and strength as well? Yeah.
Well, the first is this kind of neo-Leninist system itself is succeeding on its own terms for now, it certainly has avoided the fate of many other Leninist systems, including the Soviet Union and others, through agile adaptation, and but increasingly that adaptation is reliant upon, as we know, very authoritarian methods, very expensive and time intensive, labor intensive methods to control people and to survey them. That the Leninist system itself is calcified in the sense that it's calcifying in the sense that the elites no longer believe in the communist part of the Chinese Communist Party, and so there's a enormous cynicism and corruption, which over time can lead to very big risks for an authoritarian country, very big political risks of fracture and so on. The second would be what I argue in detail is the reversal, the stopping of Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening process, which I think we missed. Really, it began in 2008, 2009, around the international financial crisis of the time. At the time, most Western observers, most American observers said China was getting everything right. It was the only country growing, not unlike people have said early on about this COVID pandemic. But in fact, China was not getting everything right. It was accumulating mass debt. It was relying heavily on its state-owned enterprise sector, unproductive and unprofitable, state banking sector, and so on. And the mass market reforms that had caused a China boom and caused private enterprise to flourish had been reversed. So I think they're paying some of the costs of that now with not a stagnating economy, like more like Japan, I'd say, in the 1990s, not a collapsing economy, but a stagnating economy. The third weakness is geostrategic, actually, if the United States chooses to take advantage. And that is, it doesn't have necessarily a favorable geography in terms of it has one coastline. It's a continental power with one coastline, and that one coastline, where all its strategic ports and maritime pathways are abut the United States and its allies. So that could and should be taken advantage of to deter more aggressive Chinese action. I'd say finally, I mean, there's more weaknesses, but I think this people tend to gloss over the demographic problem, which is so foundational and structural. There's nothing much the Chinese can do about how bad their demographic picture is, except for change completely and allow immigrants to become Chinese. So the one child policy has destroyed the structure of the Chinese family. It has made the fact is that there are going to be more people over 65 in the next 10 years than in any other age cohort. So huge amounts of retirees without enough workers. And of course, the process of sex selective abortions means that there are so many more men than women in ways that will cause very profound social problems for China as well. So that's just a few.
Yeah. No, that's excellent, and of course, so we want our audience members to go out and purchase the book, because this really
Yes.
does just really glosses over the surface of many of the detailed analysis that you provide in your assessment. In addition to detailing these weaknesses, I think the central thesis, as I read it, of your book, and I think that you artfully captured in the title of your book, the grand ambitions of a decaying state. What do you mean by that? I understand it because I read your book, but I do think it's so central to the argument that you are trying to make and the trend that you see, and why you think it's important. So I want you to give you an opportunity here to
Yeah.
really sort of highlight that.
So absolutely grand designs, and as I detail in the book, and I'm not the first to do so, obviously, but Xi Jinping outlined in 2017 things that I think a lot of China watchers knew, but he outlined it in a more explicit fashion what those grand designs are, and that was nothing short of remaking the global order to be more favorable to the Chinese Communist Party. And he outlines how he foresees China getting there, including the need for military and technological might, but also things like the One Belt, One Road initiative and so on. So there are certain grand designs, many of them realized. So China will have the biggest navy in the world in 10 years. But the decay inside, and I think we're seeing this play out. Um, let's take this year, for example. Okay, so uh, China, as I detail in my afterword about COVID, really did not handle. I'm sort of understating this. Did not handle COVID well. And it turned a local epidemic into a pandemic through misgovernment, through just the kind of maladies of an authoritarian government. Cover-ups and so on. It didn't just affect the rest of the world. It affected, in fact, the Chinese people. And it wasn't, the answer that Xi Jinping came up with was not to hunker down and deal with the problem necessarily. It was to lash out internationally. So this is the year that we saw a skirmish, with India, and we saw more stronger and more sort of provocative action around the Taiwan Strait, and we saw the march into Hong Kong to undo, the one country, two systems arrangement, and then the more aggressive disinformation campaigns here in the United States about the pandemic. So I argue the nightmare scenario is unfolding. It's that Xi Jinping and the CCP feel more besieged than we think they do, but they have the power now to cause huge disruptions to the global order, to distract from internal impediments.
Mm. Well, I mean, in addition to these grand ambitions and this the decay, you also put forth a pretty sort of arguably somewhat provocative notion, because it's sort of seen as of the past, but that China is an empire, and this notion that it is an empire seems central to your thesis. Why is that?
Well, China is an empire. I mean, of that, I think it's indisputable. I mean, if you look at any definition of an empire, I mean, it is lording over territories that past dynasties conquered. From parts of Mongolia to Xinjiang to Tibet to Hong Kong, obviously its eyes on Taiwan. There's no question that China is an empire, and it always has been. I mean, that's how it saw itself. The reason I think that that's the reason that I think that is problematic for China is that it's the only remaining empire in the world, really. So it's not. It's going against historical trends where, and we see that inside China. We see the ruthlessness. In order to lord over an empire in the 21st century, I mean, we see what you have to do. I mean, brutality in Xinjiang and so on is in fact an empire trying to control a restive population, a culturally and religiously pluralistic population. And so again, I mean, they're quote unquote succeeding in that strategy for now. But the question is, so how many more Xinjiangs and there's a lot to sort of lord over if you want to control that empire. And finally, I'd say the imperial way of thinking is still very strong. So I have the reason I go through the historical chapter in my book or chapters in my book is because, as we all know, China has a very strong feeling about the way the world order is supposed to operate, and countries that are in its periphery that are seen as lesser are supposed to defer to China. Now, that doesn't mean we're going to go back to a tributary system or anything like that, but there could be a 21st century tributary system where China actually is the center place where it controls people's foreign policies and so on. So I think it's very important to note and to keep watching China as an empire.
So I mean, I think you've objectively pointed out a lot of these weaknesses and highlighted, really how this overstretch that it's, that it's currently engaged in. Do you think Chinese leaders are aware of their own weaknesses? In some way, when I read your book, I found it carrying some of the similar themes from Susan Shirk's 2008 book, The Fragile Superpower, because of how you highlighted these internal weaknesses. But in your view now, I mean, it's been 12 years since, 13 years since that other book that I mentioned. But you seem to draw very different conclusions now. So again, do you think Chinese leaders are aware of their own weaknesses?
Yeah, I mean, in 2008, China was not a superpower.
Mm,
It's uh, and perhaps fragile is too strong a word, but I'd say that I say they are aware, as I outline in my book. Documents leak on a fairly frequent basis about Chinese own assessments of, or I should say, the Chinese Communist Party's own assessments of its vulnerabilities. This famous document 9 that leaked, which listed a dizzying array of things the Chinese state has to worry about, from what they call cultural and spiritual pollution, meaning Western ideas about democracy and freedom, they see as a threat to anything having to do with pluralism. Is viewed as a threat. As I say in my book, I mean, things leak out that the Chinese leaders still see themselves under siege.
mm.
Still a Tiananmen syndrome, where their belief is still that there are hostile forces inside China working with hostile forces outside of China to bring down the CCP. So I think they are aware.
Mm. As you mentioned, as you mentioned earlier that you covered a lot of history in the book, and it seems to be a critical foundation to your thesis of how understanding the present ambitions of the CCP and the present state of China. If we could sort of apply that, sort of historical lessons, what are some of the lessons from history on how China deals with
Hmm.
would deal with great power competition?
Well, Chinese history is so long and rich and so on that I try to deal with what I call the modern period,
Mm,
which would mean, from the time the British settlers came to North America, right? Just to put it in some frame and context. And that's the Qing dynasty and the conquests first of mainland China, but then is one lesson I would say we need to keep in mind is that China is not a sort of this caricature of this peaceful kind of Confucian based whatever the caricature is of what that's supposed to look like. I mean the Qing dynasty fought many wars, including genocidal ones, to conquer the western reaches of China, and that culture of fierceness and bloody use of military force still is very much part of Chinese strategic culture. So I think we have to be very aware of that, and I bring that point up into Mao's time as well, which is China fought many wars, and even in Deng's time. And then I'd say the second thing is it can it's ideas about how to use force, and its ideas about diplomacy. So famously, and this is relevant, I think, for the Taiwan situation. Famously, of course, Deng Xiaoping's fight with Vietnam, for all measures, was a military tactical defeat of the PLA, but it was a strategic victory in the sense that the political objective of separating the Soviet Union from Vietnam at the time was accomplished. And so China is willing to take, at least then, maybe things have changed somewhat, very big tactical losses if it can
mm.
meet its strategic objectives. Anyway, the point is China is not new to statecraft. It's not new to the use of force. It has different ways of thinking about those two things than we do.
Yeah, something I really appreciated in reading your book is that you tackle a lot of big ideas and sort of our conventional wisdom on China policy through your book, and one of the areas that you tackled was on the ideological confrontation that we have with between the United States and China. And a lot of people are I think a lot of experts and other scholars tend to sometimes at least do not emphasize that enough in the analysis, or try to underemphasize the ideological component of China's ambitions. So in your view, then, what are sort of what is the role of ideology and
Yeah.
ideological competition?
Well, what I try to do in terms of this debate, and I think what we all need to do is look at what China says, right, and translate what they say, and so that I'm not the one sort of saying, well, yes, it's ideological. The Chinese view this as an ideological struggle, and so that's very clear. I mean, in the first instance, it's just authoritarianism versus democracy. So I'll take the point that it's not they're no longer trying to export communist revolution. That's fine. I'll accept that. But in the first instance, the world order is China because it's made by the United States, a democratic country. And if you look at what China's trying to do to reshape it and put its own people in charge of key institutions in order to both protect itself from criticism of human rights abuses and so on, as well as protect its quasi allies. You see that on the ideological front, it's working extremely hard, including subversion of democracies, and so it takes what it calls cultural struggle and ideological struggle enormously seriously. Taiwan is a quote unquote threat to China because let's face it. I mean, it's a threat because it's a geographic and geostrategic asset for U.S. and its allies, but it's also a threat because it's a democracy in a Chinese cultural setting, and if you're a threat because it's a democracy in a Chinese cultural setting, and if you're the CCP, looking over your shoulder at your own people, what could be more threatening than a successful Chinese cultural democracy at your doorstep?
You made a very interesting observation in I mean, multiple ones, but one that stood out in particular was about how you observed that the CCP, quote, almost collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. I mean, I think that's very a deep way of describing this. You're describing a lot of things there. Maybe what happened there? And given that the CCP has not collapsed yet, it appears to be also quite resilient. Would you agree with this
Yeah,
description of its resiliency? And
yeah.
and what do you mean by the contradictions?
Well, I think I took the line. I'm pretty sure Lenin said that about capitalism.
Mm,
That's what would happen.
mm,
But contradictions are very manifest, right? So to accept markets and accept openness to particularly during Deng Xiaoping's time, to accept openness to Western companies and Western ideas about how to run an economy, while you're still kind of calling yourself the Chinese Communist Party, and the party still plays such a big role in life. That in itself is very difficult to manage. I mean, it's a contradiction, right? It's a contradiction in the sense that you're a capitalist country with a communist title and communist political vestiges. Um, the collapse. So I think what you're referring to is Tiananmen Square, and I think it was we're finding out through great scholarship by the likes of Andrew Nathan and others that they view Tiananmen as a near-death experience,
mm,
and that it's very contingent. It could have gone a very different way in terms of the ability for the Communist Party to close ranks and rid themselves of Zhao Ziyang and others they saw as too reformist. So I think that still haunts them,
mm,
and I still think so. I think Xi Jinping's answer to these contradictions is essentially to just strengthen the party, and take the hit economically. So we see today, for example, the reporting on one of Jack Ma's financial companies that Xi Jinping put a stop to its IPO, partly because his enemies were going to gain access to finances. political enemy. So I think what he's just trying to do is strengthen the party as the answer to these contradictions. And so you're going to see a less capitalist China, less open China, maybe less dynamic China that is just has a very, very strong CCP.
A recurring theme that runs throughout the book is the connection, and you highlighted there and beautifully the connection between the CCP's external ambitions and also internal weaknesses. And here I want to sort of bring our attention to the One Belt One Road initiative, and because it's been so much talked about in the broader academic as well as the policy community, and so where do you see that sort of fit into your thesis about China's global ambitions, and how does it explain from your analysis, from your framework of analysis, the current situation with its internally within China?
Hmm. Well, so I argue that in some ways it's met its goal, which um, was simply to create a new geopolitical forum with China at the center, right? So I argue, I hope persuasively using numbers that its economic ambitions aren't quite what they seem in terms of the One Belt One Road. It's not anywhere near to reconnecting a Silk Road or anything of that nature. Part of it is just repurposed projects that were initiated way before Xi Jinping. But in terms of creating something new that a lot of countries want to join up with and talk to China about and so on. I mean, it has something like 65 countries that show up, to its annual executive meetings and so forth. In terms of the way the Chinese put it, creating new institutions with China marching closer to the center of the world stage. I think it's accomplished its objectives. And I think there's some backlash against it. Some countries obviously benefit from construction and engineering and infrastructure projects, so there's no backlash there. But other countries, are kind of questioning, what is this thing and how's it benefiting us? It has it benefiting the people and so on. So I think it's accomplished some of its main geopolitical goals, but it's economically a bit underwhelming in terms of what it set out to do.
I want to remind our audience members again that you may submit your questions via email to contact@globaltaiwan.org, or use the chat function on the YouTube page, or also utilize or tweet us at Global Taiwan, and be sure to include your name and affiliation as well. So I'm continuing on this thread on the sort of the external ambitions and internal weakness dilemma. So I'm particularly interested in how you see its internal sort of conditions, such as the fervent nationalism that's brewing in China, affect its external ambitions. How do they square in
Mhm.
your analysis?
Yeah. So, the first part of the nightmare that I described in one of your questions earlier was the tendency to be more aggressive internationally, as we've seen as a case study during COVID. In order to compensate for maladies and infirmities and to make sure that distracted from embarrassments such as the management of COVID and so on. And that's a very dangerous circumstance and situation because if you're this strong, yet you feel the need to lash out, obviously that can be combustible. But yes, and it's also riding a wave of nationalism, hyper nationalism as well. So Chinese people are no different than anybody else. I mean, they're proud of country's accomplishments and view U.S. criticisms as trying to keep China down and this sort of thing. So China does have to manage that, and certainly while it's not a democracy that is guided by public opinion, it certainly has to. There's a price to pay for looking weak to the United States, and I think that guides its policies as well. On the other hand, China can sort of control that. Propaganda can be turned down when necessary. So when the U.S. was negotiating a trade deal in the last couple of years with China, some of that anti-American propaganda and nationalism was toned down quite a bit to get a deal. So I think they're still in control of say the nationalistic tiger, if you will.
Mm. I'd like to shift gear a little bit here now and move from sort of diagnosing the problem and shifting to sort of potential responses. And a longstanding tension in U.S. foreign policy since World War II has been how to deal with Russia and China.
Mm-hmm.
And just as the United States has leveraged engagement with Beijing from the 70s, the detente with Soviet Union, some argue, especially in recent years, that the United States should leverage Moscow in the great power competition with the PRC.
Yeah.
This view was reflected in a recent analysis published by the Atlantic Council, reportedly by former senior U.S. officials in a longer telegram. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, the U.S., every 4 years it comes in and grapples with a new foreign policy framework. There should be one foreign policy framework above all else, and that is the U.S. cannot live with a hostile hegemonic power on either side of Eurasia. So it can't live with a hostile hegemonic power on the Asian side of Eurasia, and it can't live with a hostile hegemonic power on the European side of Eurasia. And that should be the guiding principle of U.S. national interest. The rest is sort of details, right? And so the U.S. So I think oftentimes the U.S. Opening to China is misunderstood. The original conception was actually not to get too close to China or get too close to the Soviet Union, but in fact have equidistant relationships with all to maximize diplomatic flexibility. Obviously, that policy was hijacked for a number of reasons and became bit too much of a cozying up to China against the Soviets. Sometimes I think appropriately, during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and so forth. But that sort of set the tone for the relationship much after that. I think, so here's the situation we're in now, which is, not a good one for us, which is that the Chinese and the Russians are getting a little bit too close for comfort. I think that one has to be careful about transformative attempts at diplomacy in terms of doing some sort of sweeping initiative with Russia, to counter China. I don't think that would work. I think what you can do is create more fissures between the two countries, natural ones. So, you look at Russian suspicions of China, of which there are many. And I think some of this was attempted with respect to strategic nuclear forces and so on, and arms reduction talks, where the Russians are very nervous about the Chinese, and there are probably others, geographically with respect to Central Asia and so on. So, I think we probably could do a bit more of that, when appropriate. It's difficult with a malign actor like the Russians, but I think what you have to do as a matter of strategy is make natural fissures between the two countries worse.
Now, I know that the primary audience for your book is the United States and U.S. policymakers and the broader policymaking community here. But what does the China nightmare mean for China's neighbors, in particular U.S. allies and partners in the region?
Well, I hope it means two things, right? So Taiwan, Japan, the closest sort of allies, South Korea, Australia, some of the Southeast Asian allies. I hope it means two things. One is that the U.S. and its allies can compete effectively and even win a competition. I mean, we have to define very precisely what that means. That China is not 10 feet tall. It is very formidable, but it probably won't get to 10 feet tall or overtake the United States. So I think it should give us some hope, in fact, that we can compete effectively. And we don't have to be defeatist and think that China is just going to run the affairs of the Indo-Pacific. On the other hand, I think it's important to oftentimes in Washington and maybe in other capitals as well, there's this sort of binary debate that is not very nuanced with respect to, is China collapsing or is it taking over the world? And if people say China's collapsing, obviously that leads to policy decisions that say, well, what we ought to do is actually accommodate them more, and they could, we don't want them to collapse, and so on. And I think that's that. I don't think that's the right debate to be had. I think in the short term, China's going to be far more dangerous than we think, and we need all manner of deterrent policies and stronger, tougher, hard line. And in doing so, we would set the conditions for, hopefully, for China to see that the path they're going on won't succeed. And I think that's the conclusions that we ought to draw.
Well, since we're at GTI here, I would be remiss if I didn't conclude our portions of the Q&A with some questions related, specifically related to Taiwan. And in your book, you suggested that Washington did not have to de-recognize the ROC. Why not?
Well, because that wasn't our policy, and when we began the process of normalization, our policy was try to get dual recognition at the UN, and look, Taiwan was governed by a very different leader, Chiang Kai-shek, who didn't want to give up on China himself. So there were mistakes that Taiwan made at the time, or the Republic of China made at the time, but everything since then has been misinterpreting what the purposes of our normalization process was, and taking too much of China's point of view on what Taiwan meant in our normalization process. But I don't see any reason. I mean, there was a two Germany policy that didn't cause less stability, or didn't prejudge the outcome of negotiations between the two Germanys. There's a two Korea policy, So this is a historical aberration, and in fact, I think is causing much more instability in the Taiwan Strait than is necessary.
Should we be more concerned about Taiwan's fate now because China is getting stronger, or because it is, as you argued, decaying?
Well, I'm arguing that it's both, right?
Okay.
So, I mean, it's sort of like with China, you have to just accept the contradictions constantly, right? So we should be very concerned about Taiwan's fate, because if you're Xi Jinping and you have all this power now, but you're also thinking that time is not on your side because of all the structural impediments that I pointed out, then Taiwan is the juiciest target on your hit list, so to speak. So Taiwan has formidable capabilities to cause a lot of damage to Taiwan. Sorry, China does. And this is the time where the U.S. really needs to meet the test of defending its ally, its quasi ally.
Yeah. Recent years, there's been a lot more discussion in public about the likelihood of a conflict in the Taiwan Strait, much more so than in 16 years, and since the 95, 96 missile crisis. In your view, what is the time horizon for a potential conflict, limited or otherwise, in the Taiwan Strait? Are we looking at 5 years, 10 years? And what can the United States and Taiwan, with Taiwan and allies in the region, to confront these threats?
Well, the time horizon is from now until we make a firm commitment to Taiwan that we will defend it if attacked, and we demonstrate the military capability and posture to do so. So Xi Jinping, the reason we're talking more about conflict is because China has improved its capabilities to attack Taiwan, and it's acting more provocatively in the Taiwan Strait. So, this fall it got rid of the so-called median line and is flying more provocative overflights around the Taiwan Strait and around Taiwan, and exercising more provocatively. So the only way to stop that is to make a firm commitment to Taiwan's defense and to demonstrate the military capability to defend Taiwan. So until we do that, it'll be quite dangerous.
So to be explicitly clear, you're arguing for strategic clarity.
Oh yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
strategic ambiguity makes no sense from a deterrent point of view. I mean, you cannot put all this military power, demonstrate all this military power I think it's very dangerous to demonstrate all this military power in the United States around Taiwan without China knowing you have a firm commitment to defend
Mm,
Taiwan.
mm. Great. Thank you very much, Dan. And I have a lot more questions that I want to ask you, but I do want to turn to our live audience members who are, stuck around and have submitted their questions. And so I'm going to turn to those now. And just a reminder to, again, the audience members that you can submit your questions via email to at contact globaltaiwan.org. Would use the YouTube function on the chat function on YouTube, and also tweet us at Global Taiwan. So our first question is from Tina Chong over at the Voice of America, and she has two sets of questions here. The first question is, many analysts have warned recently that Taiwan is the most dangerous flashpoint for the US and China to go to war. And she references the recent Council on Foreign Relations report on preventing war. In your opinion, did President Biden, in his phone call with Chinese President Xi Jinping, noting his concerns for Chinese behavior towards issues including Taiwan, did enough to deter Beijing and to decrease its pressure against Taiwan?
A phone call is never going to be enough. I mean, we have to have demonstrated military capability to deny Chinese objectives. We have to have a firm commitment to Taiwan's defense if attacked. We have to communicate those, I think, at the highest level in private to China. So I think what we call high diplomacy, not distracted by a whole set of other issues, is critical to prevent war. So phone call is never going to be enough.
Second part of the question, it looks like in the White House readout, there was no mention of the U.S. One China policy in the three joint communiques. And after Secretary of State Anthony Blinken's phone call with Yang Jiechi, the State Department readout did not have these elements. The tone was similarly very serious. Is there anything we should take note of from the omission of the standing position on the part of the U.S.?
Well, I think the Trump administration did a very good job in sort of saying, look, we follow the one China policy, but we also follow the six assurances, and we follow all kinds of, things that have been declassified about our commitments to Taiwan, and not just kind of getting up after a meeting and rote form to please China, mentioning all these commitments once again. So I think that it's a good sign that these things weren't just automatically mentioned as if we have to, sort of go through like prayer after sort of catechisms and say, okay, we met with China, one China policy. I mean, I think we will define it, and we'll define it just like China defines its own view of the one China principle.
Next question is from Bart Edis, distinguished fellow at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. What would you advise President Biden to do regarding U.S.-Taiwan relations? To continue to show support for the Asian democracy, but avoid provoking a crisis with the PRC?
Well, I think I would absolutely advise to continue along the policies of the last few years, which is improve relationships with Taiwan on a multidimensional level, from from healthcare cooperation to technological and economic cooperation, to a high pace of arms sales and things like training programs with the Taiwan military. But in order to avoid war, I think we have to take the steps that I said before. I think we have to have a firm commitment to Taiwan's defense that is explained to the Chinese privately between presidents. I think so. Diplomacy is necessary there, and explain why the status quo is just fine for everyone. And then I think a firm commitment, demonstrated military capacity. We are. I can't emphasize this enough. China is getting ahead in certain capabilities that are necessary in the Taiwan Strait, and the United States has got to show that it has the capabilities to defend Taiwan. So a number of things have to be, I think, done in addition to the support of Taiwan.
Hmm. Do you think that the Biden administration's policy priorities on climate change, the Iran nuclear deal, the Afghan peace process, and North Korea might shift the US position on China towards greater collaboration, and whether doing so might affect US policy towards Taiwan?
Well, I think it could definitely. I mean, so it's not. I think the Biden team wants to have a hard line on China and continue with some of the policies for the last few years. But I think just structurally, in terms of global strategy, once you start to prioritize things like global climate change, and you have a envoy of the stature of John Kerry who prioritizes that and has a very big team and so on. Once you start to prioritize sort of global action on non-proliferation issues, uh, the logic of that takes you to a place that even if you don't mean to, could start to um, pull back on certain other commitments, and so there's a danger. There's a danger of that because if the Chinese start to smell U.S. neediness on any topic, they'll come out right away and start to ask for concessions and try to wear us down on giving them concessions.
Got a question here that's really relevant to your book here is to what degree do you think China's more aggressive policy is driven by Xi Jinping himself? Will this more emboldened foreign and domestic policy outlast the leader who created it?
Well, I say in the book, that the trend lines were clear before Xi Jinping.
Mm.
It was actually Hu Jintao that started the big push in the South China Sea and provocations against Southeast Asian neighbors and against the U.S. military acting there. When I was still involved in government service, it was under Hu Jintao that they started to really exercise very provocative military capabilities like an anti-satellite weapon and so forth. So I think it's not just Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping, is more of a strongman type of leader, so he has the capability to take China in this direction and consolidate China's power. But I think let me put it to you this way: unless we show the CCP that this path is not the productive path, then I can see this sort of outliving Xi Jinping.
Mm. We have a question from Lawrence Delson from New York University. And this is related to a comment that you just made with regards to articulating an end to intentional ambiguity. What, in your view, would be the anticipated mainland response?
Oh, the mainland will be very angry about it, and will protest it and so on. But I don't think that that's worse than what we have today. So we're always dealing with bad and lousy options when it comes to foreign policy. So what we have today is ambiguity mixed, which hasn't stopped China from being extremely provocative in the Taiwan Strait. We're closer to war than we ever have been, and so on. Um, what we would have in this case is clarity, but we can't just go out and announce clarity. We need to take a number of other diplomatic and military steps, including diplomacy with China. Advocating our position and explaining why war is in no one's interest. So you can't get much worse than it is today. It's much more unstable. So I just think the ambiguity arguments are not working anymore.
I mean, interesting question about the demographic trends that you outlined. And the question is the inversion of China's demographic pyramid more likely to cause further internal oppression or outward aggression?
These are really interesting questions. Soon they're going to be actual policy questions. I mean, right now they have the feel of kind of science fiction because we haven't ever had a country that's going to have this many old people, without being rich per capita. First of all, second of all, we have never had this sort of experiment with the surplus of males at this level, right? So I think the question on the surplus of males leads us to more instability and provocations by China. I think an elderly population may take you a bit in the other direction. So again, you can't live with China policy without living with those sort of contradictions. But as an economic matter, there's no question that the demographic issue is going to be a big drag on the Chinese economy.
All right. Now, in a New York Times piece that was recently published by a prominent columnist titled "Biden's Nightmare May Be China," the author observed that Washington has had a history of, quote, exaggerating threats. And he cited Nasserism, Southeast Asian dominoes, and Japan as number one. In your view, how is China different?
Well, I disagree with the premise, and I wish Nick Kristof had actually, referred to my book, The China Nightmare. But I actually don't think that some of the things that Nasserism was a massive threat. But we can get into the historical debates about that. Look, if anything, we've been underestimating the China problem. People who were arguing, when I first got into this business, that China was going to be a problem were poo-pooed and said that they were warmongers and threat mongers and so on. And they've been proven correct. And so it took us a very, very long time, as it normally does in U.S. Strategic culture, to grapple with the fact that China wasn't going to turn out the way that we had planned for it. So I think if anything, we're underestimating the challenge China poses.
To build on and perhaps conclude with, your thesis of a decaying state and its external ambitions, and you argue in your response that we need to sort of leverage our strengths against China's weaknesses, and here it seems to me that a favorable sort of asset for the United States and like-minded countries is the value proposition that our societies provide. And there's been longstanding argument for a concert of democracies, a league of democracies. And to what extent do you think that this, but for various reasons, has not sort of materialized since being brought forward in national debates? But in this context of great power competition and also in the context of China's rise, what is your view on the proposition of a concert or the League of Democracies?
Well, I think if you leave it that big and that broad, it's not going to work. But if you look at the Quad, for example, the great democracies of the Asia Pacific, you can get somewhere. You can get some traction, and it's all going to depend on where geographically a country sits in terms of how it views the China threat. So the Quad works for that reason, but it's going to be extremely difficult to get Germany or France on board with the concert of democracies, particularly if China is excluded, because China is going to put enormous commercial pressure on each one of those countries. So it depends. It's going to be sort of variegated and different. I think you can organize around certain issues, technology issues, and human rights issues, military issues. So I don't see one big concert of democracy, but I could see groupings of countries with shared interests and shared values in different geographic settings.
Excellent, Dan. And really, we've taken up way too much of your time already. And again, we've only just scratched the surface of Dan's excellent book, The China Nightmare, The Grand Ambitions of a Decaying State. So I highly recommend that you purchase a copy and read it in its entirety, because again, he goes into great detail about these weaknesses and what he sees as the future trends of this critical development. So thank you, Dan, very much for joining us today, and we hope to have you back again at another one of our programs. Thank you. And to all our online viewers, stay safe and stay healthy. And we look forward to you joining us again in our next program. Thank you.
Thank you, Russell.